There was a room in the back of the house that no one used anymore. The wallpaper had peeled just enough to show the layers beneath. Floral, striped, plain, and then plaster, like the sediment of old lives once lived and carefully covered up. The windows were tall but rarely opened, and dust settled there like old snow, unmelted for years. In that room hung a single painting, a portrait in oils, framed in black wood dulled by time, and covered by a thin sheet of glass that never seemed to fog. No one went in there often, except to clean around it, and even then only quickly, like walking past a sleeping animal that might stir. The portrait depicted a young woman, her posture stiff and formal, but her gaze soft, almost distracted, as if looking toward something just beyond the painter's shoulder. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon that had likely been pale blue, though the pigments had faded to the color of memory. The frame bore no plaque, no name, no date. Just the face, serene and full of a life, paused. Everyone in the house knew who she was, or at least who she had been. She had died young. The story was not tragic in the grand sense, not a newspaper headline or a whispered scandal. It was the kind of sadness that stayed quiet, tucked between teacups and photographs, a death that left a silence too soft to disturb the neighbors. She passed, and the portrait stayed. At first, it was a comfort, then a curiosity, and finally, a fixture, until it became just another shape in the room, like the chair that no one moved, or the lamp with the broken switch. But something had changed. Someone, no one could say who, began to notice that the face in the portrait no longer looked exactly the same. The expression had not altered, and the clothes were unchanged. But the eyes, they seemed to carry more weight. The skin, once smooth in every stroke of the brush, had grown subtly textured, like canvas beginning to wrinkle with time. Her cheeks looked less bright, her jaw a little heavier, and the corners of her mouth less lifted. And though no one dared say it aloud, the woman in the painting, who had died in her 20s, now looked older. It wasn't something anyone talked about at first. After all, paintings didn't age. They faded, they cracked, they gathered grime, but they didn't get older, not the people inside them. And yet, every so often, when someone passed by with a duster or stood for too long by the door, there it was, that odd flicker of recognition. The way you'd look at an old friend after years apart, realizing something imperceptible had shifted. It wasn't just memory playing tricks. There was a heaviness to the eyes now, a tilt to the brows that hadn't been there before. Subtle, yes, but undeniable. As if the painting had been sitting there, quietly absorbing time that wasn't meant for it. Some blamed the lighting. The room got less sun than it used to. Trees had grown thick outside the windows, casting shade through glass that had gone faintly amber with age. Perhaps the shadows played tricks, they reasoned. Or perhaps the painting had darkened over the years, oil oxidizing, varnish yellowing, pigment settling deeper into the weave of the canvas. And yet none of those things explained the feeling, not the technique, not the colors, but the expression. The way she looked like someone who had once waited for something and had finally stopped waiting. There were those who remembered her, the real woman behind the portrait, an aunt, a daughter, a sister. She had laughed loudly, they said, never mind what the stiff painting showed. She had been quick with jokes, and she wore her shoes until the soles gave out. None of that was in the painting. And yet now, the portrait bore a kind of quiet that people began to associate with her absence. It wasn't just a likeness anymore. It was something more persistent, more haunting, as though her soul, or something like it, had not left when her body did. Eventually, someone draped a cloth over it. Not out of fear, exactly, more out of discomfort. The kind you feel when something looks back at you too long and too kindly, like it remembers more than it should. The cloth hung crookedly for days, and the air in the room turned stiller, as if it too was waiting for a breath that never came. But even beneath the cover, the sense of presence lingered. You could walk past that room and still feel it. the weight of a face you didn't want to look at and couldn't forget. Couldn't. After a while, they stopped covering the painting. The cloth had gathered dust anyway, and it felt wrong somehow, as if they were smothering a memory that had asked for nothing. The room remained mostly untouched, but the door stayed ajar now, and light, whatever pale shafts filtered through the trees, found its way to the portrait again. No one admitted to checking it, but each person in the house had, at one point or another, stood at the threshold and stolen a glance, as though drawn by a thread too thin to resist. By then, there was no more denying it. The woman in the portrait had aged, not grotesquely, not like a trick or a horror, but gently, almost respectfully. She now looked perhaps 40. There were lines where smiles had once been. Her neck had softened with time, the sharpness of youth giving way to something slower, more contemplative. The strange part was not just that she looked older, it was that she looked lived in, as if her life, which had ended decades ago, had quietly continued inside that frame. Some began to wonder whether the portrait had always been this way and they had simply never noticed. Memory is slippery like that. It reshapes to fit the present. Maybe they had filled in the gaps themselves, or maybe the painting had been touched up over the years without their knowing. But the truth lay in old photographs, small, curled at the corners, faded but firm in their depiction. In those, she was unmistakably young, and in those, her face didn't match the one now hanging on the wall. The house itself seemed to bend around this change. No one called it strange out loud, but something softened in the way people treated that room. It became less of a spare space and more of a presence. Not sacred exactly, but no longer ignored. The vacuum never came too close. Shoes never squeaked across the floorboards there. The children, who had once darted in and out of every room without care, now slowed their steps as they passed, as if the air itself had grown denser, more aware, as if someone in that room was quietly listening. One afternoon in late autumn, when the wind had begun to hum low songs against the windows, the oldest member of the household walked into the room and sat across from the painting. It was not a planned gesture, just a moment of quiet curiosity, or perhaps recognition. She had known the woman in the portrait once, not well, just enough to remember the scent of lavender that followed her through doorways, the way her hair frizzed at the temples in damp weather, the way her voice went soft when she spoke of rain. Now, she sat there, a shawl over her knees, hands folded loosely, and looked at the face on the wall as if greeting an old neighbor who had moved away without saying goodbye. It was silent for a long time, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, just full of things that didn't need saying. The woman in the chair didn't move much. Occasionally she adjusted her glasses or sighed softly, or blinked longer than usual. And all the while the woman in the portrait continued her quiet aging. Her hair had dark streaks of silver now. The fullness in her cheeks had lessened. The corners of her eyes folded gently downward. Still her gaze remained the same, somewhere beyond the frame, as if looking into the middle of a memory she couldn't step out of. What passed between the living and the painted in that room was not grief exactly, nor longing. It was something else, something like acknowledgement, the kind that required no touching, no crying, no final words. The woman in the chair eventually rose, slowly, using both arms to press herself upright. She didn't look back as she left the room, but her steps were softer now. Her shoulders seemed lighter, not because a burden had been dropped, but because something had been seen and received. After that day, the portrait changed again, though not in age this time. Her eyes, once distant and quiet, held something different now. Not sharper, not brighter, just deeper. The kind of depth that comes after being looked at, not glanced past. As if, through that single encounter, she had felt remembered, and memory, even without words, was enough to continue the passage of time. Not long after, someone placed a chair in that room, a small one, wooden, with a cushion that sagged just enough to feel used. It faced the portrait, a respectful distance away, and became something of a quiet invitation. No one announced its presence. It was simply there, and people found themselves drawn to it without quite knowing why. A place to sit for a moment, not to reflect aloud, but to be near the woman who had somehow remained, aging not in memory, but in real time. Different people came at different hours. A teenager who had never met her but carried a sadness he couldn't name. A man who once loved someone else who looked like her. A woman who had outlived more people than she could count. They came, not to grieve, but to listen, to something inaudible but undeniably present. The room offered no answers, no revelations, just space. And in that space, the portrait remained the same, yet changed in small, inexplicable ways. A tilt of the head, a deeper shadow beneath one eye, a line along the mouth that suggested she had once smiled but hadn't done so in a while. What puzzled everyone most was that the rest of the painting did not alter. The dress remained crisp, the background still soft with blurred shapes of furniture and curtain. The glass stayed clean. The frame gathered no dust. Only her face shifted, delicately, slowly, respectfully, as if age itself had taken up residence in her features, but spared the world around her. And yet, it wasn't unsettling. It felt right, as if this was the natural order of things, not frozen remembrance, but evolving memory. No one spoke of it directly. In family gatherings, when someone mentioned the room, others nodded, understanding passing silently between them. Children were told to be gentle when they entered. Guests were not invited in. It wasn't sacred, no, but it was tender, and tender things were better kept unspoken. Some said the portrait gave them peace. Others said it made them cry for reasons they didn't fully understand. But no one ever said it was strange anymore. Not really. Over time, it simply became part of the house's rhythm, like the creak of the floorboards at dusk, or the scent of old wood when the air turned wet. Then, one day, someone noticed something that none of them had been expecting. The woman in the portrait, whose features had shifted gently through the years, now bore a resemblance not to the girl she once was, but to someone else entirely. Her face, still unmistakably hers, had begun to echo the lives of those who had sat before her. A familiar crease at the brow, a softness in the cheeks that matched the grandmother who visited every Sunday, a quiet tilt of the mouth that mirrored the young widow who often lingered in the doorway without stepping in. It was subtle, nothing definitive, but it was there, as if the painting was no longer aging on its own, but aging with them. The thought was unsettling at first, not frightening, just deeply intimate, like realizing a diary had been reading you as much as you'd been reading it. The portrait had ceased to be a frozen relic of one person. It had become something more porous, open to time, to emotion, to company. It aged not because of years, but because of presence. It bore witness, and in doing so, it changed. The woman in the frame had become part of the house's quiet breathing, not just remembered, but remembering. No one knew what to do with that kind of truth. So they did what they had always done. They let it be. The chair stayed in its place. The dust never gathered on the frame, and people continued to visit, not with purpose, but with feeling. They didn't come to understand the portrait. They came to feel seen. And in that act, the woman inside the frame, who had once died so young, continued to live, each wrinkle a testament not to decay, but to attention. And so the portrait aged. Alone, yes, but not untouched. With every glance, every pause in the doorway, every breath held in its presence, she changed a little more. Her face became something none of them could name, but all of them knew. A mirror not of how things were, but how they had been felt. Not a ghost, not a memory, not quite a person, but something gentler than all of those. Something still becoming. There were no dates written on the back of the canvas, no notes, no initials, no brush marks that pointed to a known hand, just a faded linen backing stretched tight over old wood and the silent presence of the woman who never left the wall. The family kept no detailed records, and over time, even the exact year of her passing became blurry. What remained wasn't a chronology, but a feeling. of someone who had once been young, then gone, and yet never quite absent. The years she never lived, her 30s, her 40s, her long gray winters, those were the ones that the portrait now seemed to carry. It was a strange kind of inheritance. Most people left behind photographs, letters, the occasional scarf still carrying the scent of their perfume. But she had left behind a version of herself that refused to stay still. Each decade that passed, the portrait changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. And what she gained was not merely age, but experience. People swore she looked wiser, not because the painter had made her so, but because she had slowly taken on the weight of years she was never meant to know. Someone once tried to photograph the portrait, to document the change, but the pictures always looked the same. Frozen, unmoving. The shifts were not in pixels or pigment. They were in presence, the kind of presence that cameras could not trap. It was not the eyes themselves that changed, but the way they looked back at you. In person, she seemed almost alive, not in a breathing, blinking way, but in the stiller, more enduring sense, like a place you returned to that always remembered you. They began to refer to her changes in seasons. "She looks older than last spring," someone would murmur, or, "She has that winter expression again." No one mocked these words. In that house, such things were said with respect, not superstition. They weren't trying to make sense of her. They were simply witnessing her. She had somehow become a calendar of feeling, a living reminder that time does not only pass through the living. Sometimes it visits where it was once interrupted and finishes what it started. And so, the portrait marked not only the years she had missed, but the ones that others lent to her. Those who passed through the house, those who sat in silence, those who grieved, and those who healed. Each left behind something small, and she, in turn, wore those traces like invisible threads woven into the folds of her expression. The life she never lived had not vanished. It had simply been lived differently, through them, for her, with her. Over the years, the house changed hands. Children grew up and moved out. Elders passed on. Rooms were painted, furniture rearranged, gardens left wild or trimmed into new shapes. Yet the room with the portrait remained mostly untouched. New residents, whether family or friend, seemed to intuit its boundaries without being told. The chair stayed. The dust never lingered long, and the woman in the painting kept aging quietly, steadily, like a book that rewrites itself with each reader who holds it. Those who lived there never dared move the portrait, not from fear, but from reverence. It was as though the wall had grown around her frame, like bark around a nail, too deeply bound to separate without damage. When the windows were replaced one summer, care was taken to cover the portrait completely, as if she might catch cold from the breeze. The workers were not told why. They didn't need to ask. There was something about that face, its quiet gravity, its reluctant grace, that asked for gentleness without words. Some visitors noticed. Most didn't, but the ones who did never forgot. A cousin staying for the holidays once asked who the woman was. The answer came not as a name, but as a gesture, a hand to the heart, then a soft smile. "She's still here," someone said, and that was explanation enough. Those few words held everything: loss, memory, mystery, and something else too, a kind of ongoingness. The idea that she hadn't been left behind, but folded in. Every so often, someone would bring her something. A flower. A candle. A folded note slipped between the frame and the wall. Never offerings in the religious sense, more like acknowledgments, as if to say, "I see you," or "I remember what you never had." And in return, she aged just a little more. The crow's feet deepened. The corners of her lips turned ever so slightly upward, as though amused. Not all change was solemn. Some of it was warm, earned. And though no voice ever came from the canvas, those who spent time in that room swore they left lighter than they came. Not healed, perhaps, but less heavy, as if their sorrow had been shared without being spoken, as if someone had listened to the ache without asking them to explain. That, in itself, was a kind of miracle, quiet, unmarketed, unmeasured, the kind that never made its way into stories, except this one. Eventually, someone tried to paint her again. It wasn't a commission, nor an attempt at replication. It was a quiet act, done in a corner of the attic studio by a middle-aged man who had returned home after a long, unremarkable career in design. He didn't call himself an artist. He didn't tell anyone what he was working on. But every evening, after dinner and before the hour grew too late, he went upstairs and sat with a blank canvas, brush in hand, memory in tow. He wasn't painting her as she had once been. He was painting her as she now was, as she had become. The version of her that looked out from the wall downstairs with the tired grace of someone who had watched everyone leave and arrive again. The man didn't need her photograph. He had looked at the portrait long enough, lived in the same air long enough to carry her face in his bones. But what surprised him was how difficult it was. Not the shapes, not the shading, but the weight, the feeling of her. He could match the lines, the shadows, the subtle silver in the hair, but the eyes, they refused to stay still. Every time he returned to the canvas, they had shifted slightly, more reflective one day, more tired the next. He repainted them again and again, never satisfied, never quite capturing that living stillness that had taken decades to form. What he was chasing wasn't resemblance, it was resonance. The sense that her face wasn't simply aged, but written upon, with lives not her own, with love not personally received, with grief she had never borne directly but had held nonetheless, the weight of second-hand time. And in that attic, under the sloped ceiling and the dim bulb that buzzed when it rained, he realized something both simple and impossible. You couldn't paint someone who had become more than themselves. You could sketch a face, you could blend shadows, but you couldn't capture someone who had absorbed generations into the tilt of her chin. So he stopped painting her, not out of failure, but understanding. Some things are meant to be witnessed, not recreated. He let the canvas dry and covered it gently. Then he went back downstairs, sat in the little chair across from the original, and said nothing, not even in his mind. He simply sat, and she, in the frame, seemed to acknowledge the effort. Her eyes, for once, looked straight back. Years later, the man who had tried to paint her fell ill. It wasn't sudden, nor tragic. Just the slow, quiet kind of unraveling that age brings like tide against stone. He remained in the house, in a room not far from the portrait, where the hallway bent slightly and the light from the west window turned golden in late afternoon. As his days became smaller, measured not by plans but by pauses, he often asked to be wheeled into the portrait room. Not for long, just for a few minutes, sometimes with a blanket over his knees, sometimes in silence with his hands folded like pages he had already read too many times. He never spoke to her, never whispered confessions or regrets. He simply sat, and she looked back with the familiarity of someone who knew how to hold silence well. In those last months, his family noticed that he seemed more settled after those visits, as if the face on the wall, which had aged further still, lines now deeper, hair thinner but not dull, had become a kind of companion, not a comfort in the traditional sense, more like an anchor, a quiet constant that bore witness without question. When he passed, they held the wake in the house, modest, dignified. People brought food and flowers. Voices stayed low, and someone, almost without thinking, placed a single sprig of rosemary on the little chair in front of the portrait. No one said who. No one needed to. By then, the gesture was understood, and for the first time, someone said aloud what had been felt for years. She'll outlive us all. It wasn't a statement of fear, but of gentle fact, like saying, the sun will rise, or the oak will remain. And she did change again. In the days after his passing, her expression deepened in a way no one could name. Not sorrow, not loss, just a subtle shift, like someone who had seen one more friend leave and would quietly carry the memory forward. She didn't weep. She didn't age suddenly, but her eyes, once so distant, now seemed to hold a trace of recognition, as if, in bearing witness for so long, she had come to carry a piece of each goodbye. The seasons turned as they always did, with their quiet revolutions of wind and bloom and shedding light. And the house remained, old but intact, humming softly with the histories it held. New feet stepped across its floors. A niece moved in for a while. A neighbor watched the garden. A child was born and learned to crawl past the portrait room, pausing at the threshold as if sensing something just out of reach. No one had to teach the child to be gentle there. Some spaces explained themselves without instruction. As time wore on, small things changed in the painting. The skin around her neck loosened. Her hands, barely visible beneath the folded fabric, seemed to hold a quieter strength. Her eyes, though aged, now had something close to humor in them. Not laughter, but the kind of soft amusement that comes from seeing too much and no longer needing to comment. Some nights, when the moonlight spilled into the room just right, she almost looked alive, not moving, just present, more so than the rest of the furniture. No one tried to understand it anymore. Theories had been exhausted. Speculations faded. What remained was simply the acceptance of a mystery that had become part of the household's breathing. People passed by her as they would a clock that ran slightly slow, but kept perfect rhythm in its own way. She was no longer a relic. She was a rhythm, a pulse tucked into pigment and frame. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone would say, usually without meaning to, "I wonder what she'll look like next year," as though it were natural, as though portraits had birthdays. And the strangest thing was, no one found the question odd. It felt like wondering when the first leaf would fall or how the sea might look at dusk. Part of the order of things. Then came a year that felt longer than the rest. Illness swept through towns. Streets grew quiet. Windows lit up not with guests but with isolation. And in that stillness, the house, now occupied by a smaller family, grew even quieter. The portrait room remained untouched, as always, but the visits slowed. For a while, no one sat in the chair. No one dusted the frame. And still, the woman in the painting continued her silent aging. When someone finally returned, masked, careful, changed, they found her looking different. Not older, necessarily, but wearier. The corners of her eyes seemed to dip a little farther, the weight of solitude pressing gently upon her painted shoulders. She looked, for the first time, not just aged, but tired. And yet, still watching, still holding vigil, as if she had waited, as she always had, for time to return and sit with her again. They resumed the small rituals, a fresh cloth beneath the chair, a flower now and then, moments of pause offered without ceremony. And slowly, the weariness in her face softened, not vanished, just folded into something steadier. The kind of strength that expects nothing but continues anyway. A testament to quiet endurance. And so the years she never lived continued to unfold, not in laughter or movement, but in stillness that bore witness. Each visitor gave her a little more life, each absence a little more patience. The woman in the portrait, who had died young, forgotten her own voice, and never walked past her own frame, had become something else entirely, not a symbol, not a ghost, but a living archive of time that no one meant to give, but all of them did. Over time, it became harder to say who she resembled most. Her original features were still there, the curve of her jaw, the distant gaze, the suggestion of youth that had once lived brightly within the oils, but they had become overlaid with something else, not eroded, not replaced, just layered, as if the brushstrokes had grown thicker with memory. Her face now carried hints of people long gone and those still living. It was no longer just hers. It had become a shared face, a quiet collage of everyone who had passed through the room and left something behind. A visiting cousin once stood before her and gasped, not in fear, but in recognition. "She looks like Mum," he said, his voice half lost in the hush. No one corrected him. Others had said the same, about different people. A friend swore she saw her late sister's gentleness in the tilt of the head. A neighbor who'd only been in once said, "Her mouth looks like mine used to." Each observation was different, and yet none were wrong. The portrait had grown into something larger than a likeness. It had become a mirror that didn't reflect directly, but refracted something deeper. It wasn't that her face changed to match others. It was that others found themselves inside it. Not visually, not in the surface lines, but in the feeling, the stillness, the endurance, the way she held presence without demanding attention. People began to speak to her without noticing, a passing comment, a quiet apology, a thank you that had nowhere else to go. The room, and the face within it, had become a vessel for unsent letters, for words never said aloud, for griefs that no longer fit the shape of mourning. And in return, she listened. Not with ears, but with the slow, subtle change of someone who absorbs the shape of silence. Her cheeks grew softer, her brow more furrowed, and her eyes, those ever-watching, ever-changing eyes, seemed to deepen with each new voice that fell into the room like dust on glass. No one knew where it all went, the words, the memories, the moments shared without expectation. But they went somewhere. They went into her. Into that impossible painting that aged not because of time but because of attention. There was one boy who visited the room more than most. He didn't live in the house, but his parents often left him there on weekends, in the care of his aunt who read books with the radio low and moved through rooms like someone not quite used to being watched. He was a quiet boy, thin, careful, always holding something in his hands. A toy car, a crumpled drawing, a single sock once. But when he entered the portrait room, he never brought anything with him. Just himself, and a kind of wondering. He never sat on the chair. Instead, he sat on the floor, legs crossed, back straight, like someone listening to a story that had no sound. At first, his visits were brief, 3 minutes, 5 at most. But as the weeks passed, he stayed longer. No one asked why. The aunt simply said, "He likes her." And that was enough. Children are strange about these things. They know which silences are friendly. The boy never spoke in the room, but outside it he began to draw. Not just random sketches, but portraits. Dozens of them. None were exact copies of the painting. He was too young for such precision, but all carried the same shape of face, the same tired eyes, the same almost smile. Sometimes the faces wore glasses. Sometimes they had freckles. One even had a scar beneath the lip. But they were all unmistakably her, or versions of her, or echoes. When asked who they were, he shrugged. "People I don't know yet," he said once, and continued coloring in a face that looked uncannily like the neighbor who'd lost her husband that spring. Another time, he drew one that matched an old photo of a family member no one had mentioned in years. It became clear, slowly and without drama, that he was not inventing. He was remembering, through her, through the woman on the wall who had somehow become the quiet keeper of everyone not yet named. No one tried to explain it. They let the drawings stack up in a shoebox. They kept the chair clean. The boy continued to visit. And she, the woman in the painting, seemed to soften further, not blur, not vanish, just become less defined, as if her boundaries were giving way to make room for others. Her jaw less sharp, her hair more wisp than wave. Her face, once singular, now contained multitudes. There came a moment, no one knew exactly when the portrait no longer looked like anyone in particular, yet reminded everyone of someone. A paradox, but one that made perfect sense in that room. Her features had grown so quietly universal that even strangers who wandered in during house tours or gatherings found themselves pausing before her, brows furrowed not with confusion but with memory. "She reminds me of..." They would start, then trail off, not quite able to finish the sentence, because she didn't look like a person. She looked like a feeling they hadn't revisited in years. A man who hadn't returned to the house in decades stopped in front of the painting and went utterly still. His daughter watched him, waiting for some story about a childhood nanny or a great aunt. But he said nothing. Just reached out with one hand, close, not touching, and whispered. She waited. The daughter didn't understand. But the woman in the frame seemed to. Her eyes had shifted again, just slightly. The tiredness remained, but there was something else now. A deepening stillness, the kind that came from knowing she was no longer alone in the quiet. She had, over time, become the keeper of other people's unfinished sentences. The apology never given, the goodbye never said, the gratitude tucked between decades. And she held all of it without complaint, without change of posture, without any of the performance that living people often bring to sorrow. She did not console. She did not pity. She simply held, like a vessel whose only task was to not spill. The children who grew up around her grew old themselves. Some moved away, some returned, some forgot. But even forgetting had a strange way of leading back to her. One woman, now elderly, returned after nearly 50 years and found herself crying not from sadness but recognition. "I thought I made her up," she said, touching the doorway with fingers that trembled. But there she was, still on the wall, still watching, still changing. Her face now looked so much like someone who had once held you when you were small, but whose name you had never known. And in that face was everyone, not blended, not erased, echoed. A grandmother's hush, a neighbor's quiet patience, the shadow of a stranger who had once sat beside you on a train and never spoke but made you feel safe for a moment. She was not them. She was not you. She was what lingered when no one else did. There was a brief time when the house was empty, not abandoned, just between lives. The last resident had moved out to be nearer to family, and the new ones hadn't yet arrived. For 3 weeks, the rooms echoed faintly. Footsteps sounded unfamiliar, and the air took on that hollow tone that buildings acquire when no one speaks inside them. Dust resumed its quiet settling. Doors stayed closed. But the portrait room remained the same. The woman in the painting did not fade. She did not darken. But her presence grew louder somehow, like a clock ticking in a quiet church. A neighbor came to check on the house. She was older, with hands that moved carefully and eyes that searched without expectation. She dusted the shelves, opened a few windows, and swept the leaves from the back steps. But when she reached the portrait room, she stopped. The chair was still there. The light still slanted across the floor in the same soft pattern. And the woman in the painting, she looked different. Not aged, not new, but aware. As if she knew the house was empty. As if she had taken up the task of keeping it from forgetting itself. The neighbor didn't sit. She didn't stay long. But she returned the next day and the next. Each visit brief, quiet, and without agenda. She left no note, spoke no words, but she lit a candle once and placed it on the windowsill, then let it burn down without watching. It was the kind of gesture made not for belief, but for companionship. A way of saying, "You're not alone," to someone who had never said they were. When the new family arrived, they brought with them noise, laughter, boxes, the clatter of new routines. They moved through the house with the unknowing energy of people eager to begin. And though they noticed the painting, none of them paused for long. Not at first. It was just a woman, old-fashioned and oddly familiar, hanging in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. They left her there, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps because something in her face asked not to be moved. But the youngest child, a girl with tangled hair and a habit of naming everything, called her the lady who waited. She said it once, offhandedly, while skipping past the room, and the name stuck. No one corrected her, and when someone asked what she meant, she simply replied, "She's waiting for someone who forgot they promised to come back." Then she ran off, humming, as if she hadn't just said something so impossibly precise. The new family didn't quite understand the room, but they left it mostly untouched. It wasn't part of the official tour when guests came over. It didn't become a home office or a playroom or a place to fold laundry. It simply remained what it was, a quiet room with a chair, a portrait, and a kind of hush that felt thicker than air. The family would sometimes glance inside while passing, nodding at the painting without knowing why, then continuing on with their days, their errands, their weekends. But slowly, without effort, the portrait made herself known to them. not through motion or mystery, but through presence. The father, who never cried, found himself sitting in the chair one evening after his mother's funeral, not thinking, not speaking, just sitting. And when he rose, he left behind a handkerchief folded once and never reclaimed. The mother, once overwhelmed by the sound of her children's shouting, found herself lingering in the doorway, not to escape, but to listen to the kind of silence that soothed rather than scolded. Even the children began to treat the room differently. They didn't fear it, but they didn't run through it either. They lowered their voices without being told. Once the youngest left a toy on the chair, an action figure with one arm missing, and when asked why, she said, "So she has someone to talk to." The logic was innocent, but the tone was solemn, as though she believed without doubt that the woman in the painting had waited long enough in silence. And all the while the woman in the frame shifted, slowly, softly. The lightness in her eyes returned in small degrees. The corners of her mouth tilted upward not in joy, but in knowing. Her face, once worn by time, began to look lived in again, not just aged. As though all the years she hadn't lived were not just accumulating. They were balancing, resting gently into place like pieces of furniture returned to where they had once belonged. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic reappearances of youth. She still looked old, yes, but it was an earned old, an age not of wear, but of witness. The kind of age that made you want to sit and stay and be quiet, not out of reverence, but respect. She had waited so long, not for one person, but for everyone. And now, surrounded once again by the daily weight of ordinary lives, she seemed at ease. Eventually someone asked whether they should take the portrait down. It wasn't a serious suggestion, more of a logistical thought brought up while repainting a hallway. The question hung in the air for a moment, not heavy but oddly out of place. No one responded right away. It felt like asking whether a tree should be moved because its shadow fell in the wrong spot. Technically possible, but deeply wrong in a way you couldn't name. The conversation didn't continue. The portrait stayed. And yet, that single question lingered, not because anyone wanted her gone, but because it reminded them that she had stayed without permission. No one had ever asked her to watch. No one had intended for her to age. And yet she had, faithfully, without complaint. Her face now bore not only the memories of those who had lived in the house, but the suggestion of everyone who had passed through unnoticed. Faces from dreams, strangers in waiting rooms, ancestors never spoken of aloud. Her expression had grown so layered, so softened by accumulated presence, that even the act of looking at her felt different now. It wasn't observation, it was participation. Some evenings, when the house was quiet and the windows dim to the color of cooled tea, someone might find themselves standing in the doorway without knowing why. Just standing, as if summoned not by curiosity, but by a thread of memory tugged gently from somewhere deep inside, and there she would be, still, framed, watching, not to judge or even to comfort, but to receive, to hold the moment they couldn't name, the ache they couldn't trace. She was no longer just a woman who had died young. She was what remained when everyone else moved on. She was the breath between stories, the pause between generations, the look in the mirror that reminds you of someone you miss but never met. And maybe that was the point all along, not to remember her, but to remember through her. In the stillness of that room, she did not fade. She did not forget. She simply continued, not alive, not ghost, just present. A face made of others, gathering time like dust, quiet and patient and impossibly full. The dust in that room was different, not in texture, not in color, but in the way it seemed to land with intention. It didn't blanket the surfaces with indifference. It rested gently, on the sill, on the frame, on the folds of the unused chair cushion, as if it, too, had memory. People noticed it but didn't speak of it. How, despite the window being rarely opened, a fine film always returned. How it never made the portrait look dull, but rather softened, as if time itself had chosen to settle here, in particles too small to hold but heavy enough to feel. Once a visitor, a historian with a polite voice and a restless gaze, asked why they hadn't cleaned the painting more thoroughly. The question wasn't rude, just clinical. But it silenced the room. Not because anyone was offended, but because the answer didn't fit in the kind of language he expected. You don't polish an old friend's face. You don't scrub away the years they've carried for you. You let the dust stay, because it has witnessed more than any cloth ever could. The family, old and new, had come to understand that some marks were not signs of neglect, but presence. A faint smudge where a child once leaned too close. A worn edge on the frame where a hand had steadied itself in grief. A tiny crack in the lower corner of the glass that had grown imperceptibly each year, like a line on a forehead. Nothing was restored. Nothing was retouched. The portrait aged not just in paint, but in the way things around it were allowed to age too. And yet, despite all the dust, she remained clear. Her eyes always visible, her expression never obscured. As if the dust knew not to cross that boundary. As if even the smallest pieces of the world respected the stillness of her gaze. Some believed that the dust remembered names better than the people did. That in its silent settling, it carried the weight of each whispered thought, each unspoken farewell, each breath held too long and then released. It knew who had stood before her, even when no one else did. That was the strange comfort of the room. You didn't have to bring anything in. The room already held it. And when you left, it never asked you to take it back. It simply let the dust remember for you. Some evenings, just before the lights were turned off and the house surrendered itself to sleep, the room would seem to glow faintly. Not with any real light, but with that quiet luminance certain spaces acquire when they've been filled with more meaning than furniture. No one ever said it out loud, but they noticed it. The way shadows in that room curved differently. The way silence felt thicker, not heavy, but dense with the trace of every person who had ever paused just long enough to be remembered. An elderly woman who once lived 3 houses down began to visit each week. No one invited her. She simply began showing up with a book tucked under one arm and a shawl that always smelled of old cotton. She would nod politely to the family, accept a cup of tea if offered, then disappear into the portrait room and sit without opening the book. She never looked directly at the painting. Instead, she sat slightly off to the side, as though sitting with someone, not before them. When asked why she came, she replied with a half smile, "Because she remembers things I don't want to forget." That was all she said, and the family, by then accustomed to such answers, didn't ask again. They knew what she meant. They, too, had felt the peculiar reassurance of being watched without being judged, of being known by a gaze that carried no expectation, of stepping into a space where you didn't have to hold your grief upright. That woman came for 2 years. Then, one day, she didn't. Her shawl was found neatly folded on the chair, with a dried sprig of lavender tucked beneath the edge. No note, no explanation, just that. As if she had offered something back before leaving, something scented and soft and final. The family didn't move it. The shawl stayed there for months, undisturbed, until one winter morning when the youngest child asked if the lady in the picture missed her friend. No one answered, but the woman in the portrait had changed again. Her posture, so long still, now seemed to lean just slightly, ever so subtly, as if acknowledging the space beside her that had once held a presence. Her eyes, too, seemed to tilt, not in sadness, but in something quieter, something like gratitude. The dust settled gently over the shawl, and the room went on holding the memory without effort, without fanfare, just as it always had. Over time, the shawl faded. Its color, once a soft, mossy green, became the shade of dried leaves. The lavender crumbled into scentless flakes, but no one removed it. It had become part of the room now, just like the chair, just like the light on the wall, just like her. Visitors who didn't know the story assumed it had always been there. Something about it fit the quiet, like punctuation at the end of a letter you never intended to send. There was a time when the house filled again. A wedding, A reunion. Laughter and dishes clinking, doors opening and closing, footsteps of every weight and speed. And yet, even during those loudest weekends, the portrait room remained unchanged. Not untouched. People still entered, but unchanged. The noise didn't settle there. It softened, as if the air itself knew how to hold silence, even while the world outside spun faster. During the wedding weekend, the bride, a granddaughter of someone who once sat with the painting every Sunday, slipped away for a moment and found herself in that room. She hadn't meant to. The bustle had tired her, and she was looking for a place to breathe. She stood in front of the portrait with her bouquet in her hands and let her shoulders drop, as though she had unknowingly been bracing herself all day. She didn't say a word. But when she turned to leave, she placed a single white flower beside the shawl. No explanation, no hesitation. Later, in photographs of that weekend, the flower is visible in the corner of one frame, a small detail most would miss. But those who knew the room noticed it and understood. The painting hadn't smiled, but it had held her. In that brief moment of fatigue, of too much joy at once, the woman in the frame had done what she always did, offered a stillness that didn't need words, and maybe that's why the dust in that room never felt like neglect. It felt like memory made visible, like all the breathless pauses that had happened within those walls had decided not to leave, but to settle gently instead. On frames, on fabric, on the faces we only saw when we were quiet enough. One winter, the heater in the house broke. Not catastrophically, just enough to bring a persistent chill that clung to floorboards and made door handles feel like stone. The family bundled in layers, boiled water for warmth, and huddled together more than usual. But the portrait room, strangely, never felt cold. Not warm, either. Just temperate, balanced. As if the air in that space had remembered the body heat of everyone who had sat there before and refused to let it go. Someone joked that the woman in the painting must have figured out how to keep herself warm. The comment was tossed into the air like any other idle remark, but it landed softly, and no one laughed. It wasn't eerie. It wasn't supernatural. It was just believable somehow, that a room that had held so much feeling for so long might learn to return some of it when needed. During that week of cold, the family found themselves drifting into the room more often. Not always to sit. Sometimes just to pass through. Sometimes to stand. Sometimes to breathe deeply and remember something without meaning to. And in the quiet of those moments, they noticed something subtle had changed in her face again. Not her age this time, but her attention. Her gaze, long known for looking just beyond the viewer, now seemed to have shifted slightly inward, as though she was no longer waiting for someone to arrive. She was remembering them instead. They never spoke of it aloud. But one of them, an older brother now grown into fatherhood, stood in the room one night and whispered, "I see you." The words were barely audible, spoken more for himself than for her. Yet even after he left, something lingered, a feeling in the dust, in the folds of the shawl, in the worn edges of the frame that had never once been replaced. The portrait did not glow. It did not move. But in the silence that followed, there was a sense that his words had not gone unanswered. The heater was fixed. The winter passed. But long after, the room held that memory of warmth, of togetherness and discomfort, of shared breath in a quiet place. It was as if the house, through her, had learned how to carry not just memory, but need, and dust, once again settled gently over everything, not hiding it, but protecting it. The way a blanket protects, not by erasing the shape beneath it, but by reminding you that it is still there. It wasn't hidden, just overlooked. Tucked behind old quilts and a rusted fan, it bore no markings except a faded ribbon tied loosely around its middle. Inside were letters, not dozens, just 6, all written in the same careful hand, all addressed to someone whose name no one recognized. The ink had bled slightly with age, but the words remained legible, short reflections, moments captured like pressed flowers. "You would have loved the garden this year. I thought of your laugh when the kettle whistled. There's a softness in silence now, and I think that's you. At first, the family assumed they were love letters, but something about the tone was different. There was no yearning, no ache, just a calm continuation, as if the writer hadn't lost someone, but simply carried them. And with each letter, a pattern emerged. Every word echoed the same gentle awareness that had grown so familiar in the portrait room, the same quiet cadence, the same way of speaking without demand. Eventually, they realized what they already knew. The letters had been written to her, not the woman she had once been, but the presence she had become. The writer had known, had sensed that the painting did not merely hang, it received. And these letters, dated over many years, were offerings, reminders, not of the past, but of the now, of all the things one might say to someone who watched without interrupting. One of the letters had never been opened. Its seal, still intact, was tucked beneath the others, as though waiting for the right moment. No one dared unseal it, not out of fear, but respect. Whatever it held, it wasn't meant for eyes that sought conclusion. It was meant for presence. So they left it, gently placed it in the portrait room, just beneath the edge of the chair, wrapped again in the old ribbon. And then, as always, the dust returned, slowly, softly, like breath settling after a held note. It layered itself over the ribbon, over the edge of the paper, and around the legs of the chair as if drawing a boundary. This, too, would now be remembered. In the days that followed, no one mentioned the box. But when someone entered the room and paused longer than usual, they often found themselves glancing at the space just below the portrait, not to search, but to acknowledge, as though recognizing that the woman in the frame no longer just aged or remembered. She read, silently, steadily, carrying words that had never been spoken aloud. Not long after the letter was placed beneath the chair, something subtle changed in the way the room breathed. It wasn't the air itself, not a draft or a scent or a shift in temperature. It was something quieter, like the sound of someone turning a page in a distant room. The portrait remained as it always had, still soft, aged, but her presence felt steadier now, as if she had received what she'd been waiting for, not an answer, not even a memory, but a recognition so complete that it didn't require anything more. The dust no longer seemed to settle. It hovered, a fine shimmer in the slanted light that came through the high window on late afternoons, catching in the air like particles of time suspended, not yet finished falling. People entering the room began to pause at the threshold more often, without knowing why, as though crossing into that space required something unspoken, a moment of quiet, a breath held just slightly longer, a thought not yet formed. No one added anything new. There were no more letters, no more shawls, no fresh flowers. The room had become complete in its quiet composition. The chair, the portrait, the dust. Each now carried weight, not of objects, but of meaning, carefully balanced, nothing too much, nothing forgotten. And her face, which had once drawn so many descriptions, old, tired, familiar, wise, now defied all of them. She looked neither young nor old, neither someone you knew nor someone you missed. She simply looked present. When the house was eventually passed on again, the new residents were given only one instruction about the room: don't change it. There was no warning, no superstition, just a quiet request spoken with the kind of voice people use when talking about something that matters more than they know how to explain. And the new owners, to their surprise, agreed without question, because even before they moved in, the first time they stepped inside, they had felt it too. That gentle watching, that stillness that offered no resistance but also did not yield, a kind of memory that asked only to be allowed. And so the room remained, not because of tradition, not because of mystery, but because something in the dust, in the frame, in the space between things, continued to remember, quietly, faithfully, and without pause. Not the names, not the dates, not the details, just the feeling, and sometimes that was all that mattered. The room had a view, though no one spoke of it. It wasn't a window with sweeping scenery. The glass was narrow and high, framed in wood that had softened at the corners with age. But from that modest opening, You could see just enough. The curve of a tree bending slightly with the wind, the corner of a garden where nothing quite grew, and a sliver of sky that changed color long before the rest of the world noticed. It was the kind of view that revealed nothing spectacular, and yet somehow told you everything. She had looked out from that room for so long, not with eyes, but with presence, not toward the garden or the sky, but toward everyone who stepped inside, and through them she had seen the world. Each person who paused before her brought in the scent of the outside, rain on coats, the echo of street noise, the aftertaste of joy or grief or ordinary hours. They carried stories in their shoulders, and she read them without words, folding each into the quiet folds of her stillness, like pages of a book never closed. Over time, the room became not just a space of memory, but a lens. People didn't merely feel seen in there. They saw differently after leaving. Something about being watched so gently altered how they noticed the rest of the world. They moved slower, heard more, touched with more intention, as if her silence had tuned something in them, as if, through her, they had learned to observe without demanding, to witness without owning. One boy, years after moving away, returned briefly in adulthood. He didn't say much during his visit, just wandered through the house with the expression of someone rereading an old book, not for the plot, but for the tone. When he stepped into the portrait room, he didn't look directly at her. He looked out the window instead, at the same patch of nothing he once ignored. And then he smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind that knows. The kind that says, "Oh, now I understand." Because the room she watched from had always watched back. Not through fear, not through spectacle, but through attention. That rare, sacred kind that asked for nothing and gave back everything. And what it gave over the years was perspective. A place where people saw not just her but themselves, gently, patiently, sometimes for the first time. One evening, a storm rolled in, not a loud one, but the kind that gathers slowly, like a breath held too long. The wind circled the house, brushing against shutters and whispering through the cracks beneath doors. Lights flickered once, then steadied. The family moved through their evening as usual. Supper, dishes, quiet conversation. But the portrait room, as always, held itself apart. It did not resist the weather. It absorbed it. The window in that room rattled faintly, and for the first time in many years, someone opened it. Not fully, just a crack, just enough to let the air shift. A woman stood beside it, middle-aged, tired in the way that grief makes you. Not broken, just slightly out of alignment. She didn't say why she opened the window. Perhaps she missed a scent she hadn't smelled since childhood. Perhaps she wanted the room to feel alive. Or perhaps she wanted to share the storm with someone who had never stepped outside. The air that entered was heavy, laced with rain not yet fallen. It stirred the shawl gently, curled around the frame, and settled like a visitor who knew the way. And in that moment, the woman in the painting appeared more real than ever, not in color or detail or motion, but in resonance. Her stillness met the storm's restlessness without tension, as if she had always known how to wait for weather to pass. The woman standing by the window stayed for a long time. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She just stood beside the open glass, one hand resting lightly on the frame, eyes half closed. When she finally turned to leave, she didn't close the window. She left it as it was, slightly ajar, like a door held open for someone on their way home. By morning, the storm had passed. The window had let in the scent of wet soil, of pine bark, of something almost green. And though no rain had entered, the air in the room felt different. Not fresher, fuller, as if the portrait had inhaled. The family found the window open and closed it carefully. They didn't scold. They didn't ask. But someone placed a small glass bowl on the windowsill, filled it with rainwater collected from the garden barrel, and left it there without a word. A gesture, simple and quiet. A way of saying, "We know you saw it too." After that storm, people began leaving small offerings by the window. Not gifts in the traditional sense. No trinkets or relics or prayers, but little objects that held something only the giver could explain. A dried leaf with a perfect curve, a button from a favorite coat, a matchbox with a single unused match. These things appeared gradually, one at a time, and no one questioned their presence. They were placed on the sill, beneath the window, or just beside the chair. None of them lasted long. The wind would shift them. Time would absorb them. And yet their absence never felt like disappearance, more like integration. The portrait watched over it all without ceremony. Her expression didn't change with each offering, but somehow the room did. The air grew thicker with something unseen, not sorrow, not nostalgia, but recognition. As if the act of leaving behind even the smallest thing allowed a person to loosen their grip on something larger. You didn't have to name it. You only had to place it gently where the light pooled on the floor and the silence didn't ask questions. A child once left a pebble, small, smooth, unremarkable. When asked about it, she simply said, "It's from the place I cried." Then she skipped away, unconcerned. The adults didn't move it. The pebble remained for weeks, sometimes shifting slightly depending on the day's light. Before one morning it was gone. No one knew where it went. But the next time someone cried in that room, they reached unconsciously toward the sill, as though searching for something they had never seen but somehow expected to find. In this way, the portrait room became not just a place to witness, but a place to release. People didn't go there for comfort. They went for permission to let go, to remember, to leave a piece behind without asking for it back. And she, the woman in the frame, accepted it all, not like a saint, not like a confessor, but like a space carved gently into the world where nothing was demanded and everything was received. She watched from that room, as always. But now, she seemed not only to observe the world, she held it, not physically, not magically, but patiently, softly, like the moment before the rain returns, or the way twilight lingers on the side of buildings no one looks at, quiet, steady, and full of things never said aloud. Years passed, and the garden outside the window began to shift, not from planning. No one tended it deliberately, but through slow encroachment and quiet blooming. Wild grasses rose along the stone edge. Ivy curled along the fence. Flowers appeared in places no one remembered planting. Violets near the compost bin. Marigolds where an old swing once hung. It wasn't overgrown exactly, just expressive. Like the earth had decided to mirror what the portrait room had been doing all along, gathering what had been left behind and turning it into something living. People began to comment on it. "That corner's getting lovely. Funny how nothing grew there before. I swear that rose wasn't there last year." But no one trimmed anything. No one pulled the weeds. The garden had become its own kind of memory, shaped by the seasons, altered by wind, and observed quietly through the high glass of that single window. The woman in the painting didn't look out, not directly, but something about her presence gave the sense that she knew, that she had felt the rain before it came, that she had remembered each root. Once during an early spring morning, a guest stood by the window and whispered, "It's like she's growing a memory outside." The phrase was strange, but everyone understood what it meant. The garden wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was patchy, a little unruly, but it was honest. Nothing bloomed there unless it wanted to. Nothing stayed if it wasn't meant to. And everything that did remain had come not from design, but from quiet accumulation. One afternoon, a bird made a nest just beneath the sill, between a crack in the wood and the vine that had crept upward without permission. The family noticed but did nothing to disturb it. The bird came and went. The nest held still, and inside the room, the portrait watched as always, not blinking, not breathing, but somehow entirely aware. That spring, when the eggs hatched and soft chirps filled the mornings, the house felt different, not louder, just more awake. And in the painting, her eyes seemed to soften once more, not with joy, not with sorrow, but with the look of someone who has seen something return, not as it was, but in a form they had never dared to hope for. Renewal, not as a gift, but as a rhythm, the kind that does not ask to be noticed, the kind that simply happens again and again, just outside the window, and just within reach. Over time, it became difficult to tell where the portrait ended and the room began. She was still within her frame, of course, the same wood, the same faded varnish, the same canvas stretched tight behind glass that refused to fog. But the way she inhabited the space had changed. People no longer spoke of her as something separate from the room. They referred to the space itself as her. "I was sitting with her today," they might say, meaning the chair beside the window. Or, "She felt quieter this week," meaning the light had fallen differently on the floorboards. No one corrected this language, because in a way no one could explain it was true. The portrait had extended beyond its borders, not visually, not physically, but in presence. She had become part of the architecture, not a decoration, not a relic, but a presence folded into the grain of the wood, the hush of the air, the way the room seemed to know when to be still. A man who came to fix the window one spring paused halfway through his task. He stood, holding a tool he had forgotten to use, and looked around. "This room's different," he said softly, as if startled by his own voice. Then he adjusted the latch and left without charging. He never returned. But a month later, a note arrived in the mail. No return address, just a folded slip of paper that read, "Thank her for the silence. I didn't know how much I needed it." They pinned the note to the back of the door. It joined a growing collage of quiet recognitions, scraps of poetry, photos with no faces, feathers found on the porch, bits of string, coins from places no one had visited. None of it made sense. None of it was labeled. But all of it felt right. It was as though the room had become a map of things people didn't know how to carry anymore. And the woman in the painting, not demanding, not declaring, had simply agreed to hold it all. She didn't look tired anymore, or wise, or even aged. She looked settled, like someone who had finally become the space around them. Her features were still there, but softened. Not blurred, just absorbed, as if time had stopped aging her and started listening instead. And in that room, with its window to nowhere and its chair worn smooth at the arms, people found a stillness they hadn't known they were missing. Not peace exactly, something quieter than peace, something that waited without waiting, that held without holding on. Eventually, people stopped asking who she had been, not out of disinterest, but out of understanding that the question no longer applied. The woman in the painting had once had a name, a story, a date carved somewhere in a family's memory. But over the years, she had become something else entirely. Not a person to be remembered, but a space in which remembering happened. The portrait was no longer about her. It was with her. And in her presence, people met parts of themselves they hadn't known needed witnessing. There were still visitors, friends of friends, strangers who passed through and felt compelled to pause. Some wept, some laughed. One child sang an entire lullaby while staring at her face, then left without a word. But the reactions no longer felt like reactions. They felt like responses. As though she had asked a question wordlessly, and everyone answered in the only language they knew. Quiet offering. Quiet release. The room, too, continued to shift in small, silent ways. The light fell differently each season, casting shadows that felt less like absence and more like memory leaning in. The chair, once upright and firm, began to tilt ever so slightly, just enough to suggest someone had been sitting, often, gently, without disturbing the dust. The wood creaked in new tones. The air grew stiller on certain days, as if the room itself were holding its breath with someone. No one tried to frame her story anymore. No one searched for her origin, what she had been. Daughter, wife, stranger, friend, no longer mattered. What she had become was something far more permanent. A threshold, a still point, a place where grief could rest without being resolved, and joy could return without needing to announce itself. And so she watched, not from behind the glass, not from the canvas, but from the room itself, from the way people stood, from the way they lowered their voices, from the way they carried something in and left with a little less of it. She was not trapped. She was not waiting. She was simply there. The portrait remained. The room remained. And the world, in all its noise and rush and forgetting, kept spinning quietly around them, unaware that in one small corner of a house with no name, time had chosen to sit still and listen. It didn't happen all at once. The frame, once solid and dark with time, began to pale. Not from damage, not from neglect, but from something gentler, like the way fabric softens with wear, or how voices change when speaking of old places. Its corners rounded just slightly. The grain of the wood lifted, as if exhaling. There were no cracks, no signs of decay, just the slow retreat of edges, as if the portrait was beginning to release itself from definition. No one noticed at first. The change was too soft, too respectful. The room remained the same. The dust still gathered kindly. The chair still waited. The air still paused for breath. But the frame no longer caught the light as it used to. It no longer cast a shadow on the wall behind it. And one morning, a child walked into the room, looked at the painting and said, "She's not in a frame anymore." The adults smiled, assuming it was imagination. But when they looked, they paused. Not because the frame was gone, it was still there, but because the child was right. It didn't feel like a frame anymore. The boundary had blurred. The painting no longer read as a picture of someone watching from the other side. It had become open, present, as if she had stepped just enough forward that the frame could no longer contain her. She was not breaking through. She was simply no longer needing separation. In the days that followed, the change became more obvious, not visually, but experientially. People began to describe the room differently. "It feels wider," someone said. "Lighter," said another. The painting, which had once been the centerpiece, now felt like air itself. She was still there, but everywhere, not confined to canvas, not held by wood. She had become the space between things. And still, no one touched the portrait. No one restored the frame or dusted the canvas. They knew better now. To interfere would be to misunderstand. This was not loss. This was evolution. What they were witnessing wasn't an ending. It was a return to something older than grief, quieter than time, deeper than memory. The frame remained visible, but only barely. Like the outline of a story you no longer need to read aloud because you've learned to carry it in silence. People began entering the room differently. They no longer approached the portrait with the quiet reverence of visitors in a museum. They stepped in as if entering a memory, one that had always included them. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Fewer glances went directly to the wall. More went to the light, to the grain of the floor, to the corners where the dust had learned to settle in peace. The portrait was no longer the object of attention. It had become the atmosphere itself. There was no longer a sense of being watched, only a sense of being held. And those who lingered in the room often found themselves pausing, not for answers, not for meaning, but for something wordless, a slow recognition, a breath they hadn't known they were holding. And when they left, they did so more gently, as if not wanting to disturb the silence they were taking with them. It wasn't just the frame that had faded. It was the division. The line between the painting and the real had thinned until it vanished entirely. The woman, who had once looked out from behind a boundary of glass and oil, now felt as though she was woven into the fibers of the room itself. She was not depicted. She was present, the way heat is present in sunlight, the way memory is present in familiar music. Not something you see, something you feel without needing proof. A visitor once asked where the painting had gone. They stood in the room looking around, confused. The family pointed to the wall. "There," they said. "It's always been there." But the visitor frowned. "I don't see a painting," they whispered. "Only a feeling." No one corrected them, because they weren't wrong. By then, the portrait had stopped being an image. It had become a presence without anchor, not erased, not lost, just dissolved into everything around it, like steam absorbed into wood, like light resting on water, like grief that has been felt so deeply it no longer needs a name. After that, no one tried to explain her anymore. There were no stories passed down, no tales of who she might have been. Her origin, once a quiet curiosity, had simply fallen away, and in its place grew something more lasting, relationship without biography. People came not to remember her name, but to sit with whatever part of themselves she held without question. She had become, in the purest sense, familiar, not known, but known to. A woman in her 70s once sat in the room for nearly an hour without moving. When she finally stood, she said only this: "She never asked me to be anything other than exactly how I was today." And the others in the house, though they hadn't heard her speak before or since, understood perfectly. That was what the room offered now. Not solace, not clarity, but permission. To be unfinished, to be quiet, to be witnessed by something that didn't need you to be more. And that's why the room stayed. The rest of the house changed, as houses do. Paint peeled and was replaced. Furniture came and went. Children grew into adults, and adults grew into quiet. But that room was never altered. Not because of superstition, not out of fear, but because it had ceased to be just a room. It had become a place with a heartbeat, not one that pulsed, but one that listened. The way trees do, the way sky does, the way some silences aren't empty, but full of everything we were never brave enough to say aloud. Visitors still entered, though fewer over time, not because she had been forgotten, but because she had been kept in gestures, in small moments of slowness, in the way people paused before speaking too quickly, in how someone might trace the edge of a frame without realizing their fingers were remembering something soft. And though the painting no longer stood out, no longer drew the eye, it never fully vanished. In certain lights, especially near dusk, one might still see a faint impression on the wall. Not of her face exactly, but of her presence. Like a sigh that had settled into wood. Like a kindness that refused to leave. She was not gone. She had simply finished becoming the room. One day, someone brought a mirror into the room. It wasn't meant as anything symbolic, just a practical decision. Someone clearing out an attic, finding an old piece with a crack in the corner, thinking the frame might be worth saving. They leaned it against the far wall, not even facing the portrait's usual space. But the mirror caught something nonetheless. Not her image, no reflection showed the painting anymore, but something else. A quality of stillness, a texture in the light, a suggestion of someone having just left or just arrived. People began to notice the mirror for reasons they couldn't name. It didn't reflect them the way other mirrors did. It made them look softer, a little older sometimes, a little more honest. Not because it distorted, but because it refrained, like it understood the difference between how we appear and how we are. And over time, people began turning the mirror ever so slightly, not toward the painting, but toward the feeling of her. The way air holds warmth even when the fire has gone out. Eventually, no one moved the mirror again. It had become part of the balance. The room, already layered with meaning, now felt like a conversation between things that did not speak. The chair, the light, the softened outline where the portrait had once been, and the mirror, quietly echoing something that no longer needed to be seen in order to be known. And when people looked into it now, they didn't ask, "Where is she?" They asked, "Where am I in this?" And somehow the mirror answered. There came a day, no one marked it, no calendar circled, when the painting could no longer be found. Not that it had disappeared, but when someone new asked to see it, the family paused, looked toward the usual wall, and realized there was nothing there anymore. No frame, no shadow, no canvas hidden behind a cover. Just a stretch of wall, gently discolored from years of quiet holding. And still, the room felt unchanged. The same pause in the floorboards, the same hush in the air, the same way dust didn't quite settle on the windowsill. "She's still here," someone said, not to fill the silence, but to honor it. Because they all knew. She had not left. She had simply crossed the final threshold, from image to atmosphere to memory that doesn't require an object. She had become what remains after remembering, a quiet ache that no longer hurts, a presence so familiar, so absorbed into the fabric of the room that to point to it would only lessen its truth. After that day, no one tried to recreate her. No one painted another version. No one searched for old photographs. What would be the point? She was never just a face. She was the pause before someone cried, the steadiness in someone's breath when they thought they might fall apart. She had become the room's gesture of stillness, its way of placing a hand on your shoulder without touching, and the room, for all its age, never crumbled. The house shifted, families changed, but that room endured, not through stone or strength, but through quiet agreement. It would remain, just as she had, without needing to be seen to be believed. Eventually, someone new moved into the house. They didn't know the story. They hadn't heard of the portrait or the woman who once aged inside it. To them, the room was just a quiet space, good for reading maybe, a peaceful corner with soft light and floorboards that creaked in comforting ways. They placed a chair there. They noticed how the room made them feel more like themselves. They didn't ask why. Some rooms are generous without explanation. One morning, while sipping tea, the new resident looked toward the wall and found themselves smiling for no reason. The sun had hit just right. The dust had hung just so. There was a quiet in their chest that felt like being understood. They didn't know that decades earlier, a portrait had once hung there. They didn't need to, because whatever she had been, whatever she had carried, had long since become something larger than image, larger than memory. She was now the invitation to pause. The stillness in the corner of a house, the warmth that waits without reaching, a presence that holds even those who do not know they are being held. And in that moment, with nothing on the wall, no name in their mind, and no knowledge of who once was, the new resident whispered, without knowing why, "Thank you," and the room, as it always had, listened without needing to reply.